Welcome to Northern Lights. Today we're at the studio and home of George Morrison, a very famous, well-known Minnesota artist. In fact, it was George Morrison Day on August 7th, 1998. So you know, in Minnesota, we care about George Morrison. We're right on Lake Superior, where George works and lives. And I'm having the pleasure of discussing with him and with Margot Fortunato Galt a beautiful new book that they've just produced in, was it March 1998? I think so, that is the publication date. Minnesota Historical Society Press has brought this beautiful book out, and it's well launched. Everyone is thrilled, actually, to see it, and it is a wonderful book. The book is called Turning the Feather Around, which is one of George's special names. I thought before we talked about the book's contents, one of the things that interested me tremendously when I looked at this book, Margot, was the marvelous way you organized it. And I know that your métier is memoir, and it struck me that this is like a memoir. It's George's words. Could you tell us just a little bit about how you happened to decide to tape record George and then work with the tapes as the text of the book?
When it occurred to me that George's story should be told, I first thought about the standard biography.
Yeah.
But very shortly after, I realized that George's own words would be far more compelling. And so we spent quite a long time, from the summer of 1993 until the summer of 1995 and into the winter of 96, at various times taping, talking.
Yeah.
And then I had the luck of transcription of all of those. I didn't have to do it myself. Of all
I was
of those
wondering
tapes.
who did that, because that's a major job.
Various professional typists who do that kind of thing. And then the project really became the shaping of this mammoth amount of paper into a literary form that would capture George's voice.
I think you've been very successful with it, Margot. I was really impressed. I liked especially the way you've broken it up into little segments with a little design piece in between. And it comes through for us then as a conversation rather than just a monologue on the part of whomever you were speaking to. George, one of the things that interested me was the name of the book, Turning the Feather Around. And you mentioned to Margot that this is one of your special healing names. Could you talk a little bit about your names? Tell us what it is in Indian and Indian language, and explain a little bit about that.
Well, when I was in my illness in recent years, Walter Caribou is a elder in the village. He's not a medicine man, but he believes in the Indian ways, and he did a healing ceremony for me. But before that was decided that in order to have a healing ceremony, names were needed.
Oh, I
So
see.
he dreamed a name, but instead he dreamed two names. And one is Turning the Feather Around, and the other one is Standing in the Northern Lights. And oddly enough, they're very appropriate, because things in my life have happened with the idea of feathers, of doing a design at the Minneapolis Indian Center with a
Yes.
feather design.
I've seen that,
Yes.
George. It's beautiful.
And Standing in Northern Lights is, of course, titles of paintings that I do. So it's all connected.
How would you say those names in the Anishinaabe language?
Well, turning the feather around is said in Chippewa, Kwekiganagabu. And Standing in the Northern Lights is Wawateganagabu.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
What actually happens in a healing ceremony, George? How does that work? I know there has to be a certain amount of blessing, right?
Yes, it starts at sunrise too. It was in that sense. Walter did a lot of singing and chanting and praying, and probably in his own way in connection with the ceremony. And then I can't remember exactly how it happened, but then he mentioned the names that were bestowed on me at that moment. So.
And it really kind of worked, didn't it? I mean, you're in better health than you were when the ceremony happened, right?
Well, I hope so. I'm not believing in magic in the sense that it's going to change your life around, or a magic that makes you come alive, but it is, I think, a ceremony that makes one think about these matters, and that things are coming around in a better way.
Yes,
Yeah.
I know what you mean. One of the things that I thought was interesting in the book was that you said you never called yourself an Indian painter, but you were a painter who was an Indian. And when you have a healing ceremony, you're reaching back to your inheritance, aren't you?
Yes.
Why did you think of yourself that way, as a painter who was an Indian?
Well, perhaps you understand that a lot of historians and critics like to use the idea that the so-called Indian way of painting, or I feel that I just don't want to put it in that kind of
Category?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I think people think of something ancient and on painting on a wall, or a rock wall or something like that, I
Yes.
suppose. Yes, your work is very sophisticated. You've had some wonderful opportunities. As you interviewed George, Margot, did you find that you saw that there were turning points for George in his life as he developed as an artist and as a person?
Well, certainly illness has played a really interesting role in George's life.
Yeah, why don't you
Because
talk a little bit about that?
When I think you were 7 or 8 or 9, TB of the hip, and this
yes.
sent George down to Gillette Hospital in St. Paul for quite a long time.
How long were you there, George?
year and 2 months.
Okay.
And then the opportunity to attend the Minneapolis School of Art right after graduating from high school with, as I remember, scholarships and loans. That was important.
Oh, yeah.
And then the wonderful opportunity to go to New York, to the Art Students League. And I love the way George talks about New York as being the art capital of the world, which I think by then,
Yes.
in the early 1940s, it really was starting to become, with all of the immigrant European artists fleeing World War II.
Yes. Yes.
But then, you know, George's art as an abstract expressionist took a long time in the East developing and maturing and becoming as wonderful as it was. And this change when he came back to Minnesota in 1970.
George, what was that change when you came back to Minnesota in your art?
Well, I always associate that with the influences of all of the New York experience of being there with artists from all over the world, and a wonderful city with many museums and art
Yes.
galleries. and the general art atmosphere that was there was helped to influence and change my attitudes about art. And after spending 20 years on the East Coast, I returned to Minnesota. So all of that experience was behind me, and I connected that with my own art here.
Was it? Did Margot? You thought there was a shift again when he came back here? What were you thinking?
Well,
of?
George, I'm thinking about the study of indigenous art that you began in order to teach that Native American art
Studies.
class at the University of Minnesota. And I would say that, you know, your totems, for example, or the little chiringas that came out of the Australian totem-like forms.
Well, when did you begin the work with the wooden landscapes? Which I think, whenever I think of George Morrison, I see that beautiful wooden piece in the Minneapolis Institute of Art. That was my first piece of yours that I ever saw. And you call those landscapes. I do too. I think of them as landscapes. When did you begin working with the wood in landscape?
That all was prompted by my association with the ocean, spending many summers in tip of Cape Cod, and doing a lot of beachcombing in a way, picking up pieces of well-weathered wood that was weathered by the sun and by the Atlantic salt air, and this appealed to me in a sense of using some of these flat weathered pieces as collage material.
Right.
So that became my painting in a way, selecting different shapes and colors of wood instead of sections of paint. So I worked at that for the next 10, 15 years.
Did you immediately begin large pieces, or how did you begin that process?
Well, they lent themselves to a large scale, and that's what I kept that format. Well, also the scale of the plywood, 8 by 10 feet or 8 by 10 feet.
Yes. And you could mount it on that.
Yes.
How do you mount them? With glue? No.
Oh, well, the plywood was reinforced on the back and front to make it more sturdy and stable, and then applying the sections with glue on top.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I've enjoyed seeing you at work and down in your studio here, where you have such a wonderful collection of wood. Some of the wood you've used has been wood that you've prepared, and hasn't just been found wood, right? And some.
Well, later when I moved back to Minnesota, I didn't have the well-weathered salt air pieces, so I was making more pieces, and I began to prepare wood of my own by cutting or finding shapes of new wood, and then sometimes dabbling some paint on it, and then letting it weather for a year. Yeah.
Leave it
so
outside.
So it became gray.
Or?
Yes. So, and so that became well ready to use in that time. So I had plenty of both to choose from.
One of the things that interested me too, as I read your excellent book, is the significant people in your life. You mentioned, Margot, the business of going to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, as it was called then. Was it called the
It was called the Minneapolis School of Art.
School of Art, right,
then.
and now it's College of Art and Design. That someone must have suggested that to you, George, did it?
No.
No?
No. Say
What
that again.
happened?
No.
I was curious about how you happened to go to the Minneapolis School of Art. Did someone suggest it to you?
Well, it's the only art school in the area.
And you knew you wanted to go to an art school?
No, yes, I wanted to go study art.
Okay.
And I just sent for bulletins about the school, and it suited my needs, so I stayed there for 4 years.
Yes, it gave you a wonderful opportunity. There were people there who fostered you too. You mentioned some people who were particularly influential. Would you tell us a little bit
Absolutely.
about that?
Well, there were a couple of names, of course. Frances Greenman was a portrait painter, but she was teaching still life painting, and she was a wonderful person in many respects to be in camaraderie with her students, and she was a good influence. Another teacher was Alexander Maisley, who studied at the Chicago Art Institute of Design, which was influenced by the Bauhaus. So he had many.
Oh, sure.
He had many things in back of him to teach many of the contemporary aspects of art,
Yes.
which appealed to me, and probably which helped me to determine to go further too, to go to New York to study.
I think, Margot, you say you draw out in one place in the book that George thought he was going to be a commercial artist or maybe get into advertising or something like that to begin with, but of course you immediately fell in love with fine art, didn't you?
Yes.
That's wonderful. And it's our gain. I must say we're very lucky. But George, how lucky you've been to have been fostered along the way by these significant people. I remember in the beginning when you were in high school, there was a man who encouraged your interest in wood. You had a natural bent for carving things, making things of wood, and it was a teacher, wasn't it, at the high school in Grand Marais?
It was more of a commercial kind of study there with industrial art, which I was very handy with because of using my hands and so-called inventing things with wood and shaping wood and so on, and carving as a young child. So that was right up my alley, and I continued that right along the way.
Well, I think that as I read through the description of your life, there were so many places where people entered in and gave you just the lift that you needed at that particular moment, and that's a wonderful thing to be able to look back on, isn't it?
Yes. Very.
One place that I was curious about, you went to Europe. You were on a fellowship, right? A scholarship of some kind there? What was it?
Well, I had a chance to win. This is a competitive scholarship, and I was very fortunate to win a 1 year's trip to Europe on a Fulbright.
Oh, a
And
Fulbright.
It paid for all expenses.
Oh, wonderful.
For 1 year.
But then you left, and someplace along the line, you say in your interviews with Margot that you probably should have stayed on. What would have happened if you'd stayed on in Europe, and why didn't you?
Well, I one of the things, I think I felt the reason to come back home. And
Were you
there are many artists who like the European experience, and I think that it suited me fine for 1 year. But that was very good for me. But I guess I wanted to return to the States and come back to New York and Minnesota, and
family
for family too, and resume my life and work here.
Well, yeah, I can understand that. I think many times we feel that way. Yeah. Well, another thing that I think people often think about in your work is the horizon. And would you describe a little bit why you have that horizon in nearly everything, including the wood collages? I saw a painting in progress up in the studio upstairs that has a piece of tape across it.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, George.
Well, the piece of tape was there to indicate the horizon line, and the painting above it, and to keep the paint from the top separate from the bottom. So I'd reverse the tape in order to work on the bottom. But anyway, that horizon line was, it's a focal point in my own art that I used for that reason, to show the sky above the line, which denotes the sky, and then below that, which denotes the water or the land. And I wanted to make that distinction and to paint as such. So the landscape idea, which might be also a seascape in a sense, to determine the motive of the theme, so to speak, that the horizon line. I also like to see it in this way, that I see the horizon line as a focal point that, to my own poetic sense, seeing beyond the edge, which means to be seeing beyond or going beyond forever into the universe. And, that could be explained also in poetic terms.
And spiritual terms
yes,
too, in
yes.
a way. Margot, you vacation and spend time writing time on Lake Superior, and as George talked about the horizon, of course, the first thing that came to my mind was that Lake Superior vision, where we see out and we see that incredible horizon. Do you feel the way George feels about that? I mean, does it affect you?
Well, I think George has instructed me.
Lovely.
Talking to George about the horizon has truly made me see it, and I'm not as, I'm an earth sign, and I don't know what you are, George. What is Libra?
I think it might be a water sign.
You might be.
Yeah.
And I'm very much related to the earth, and so my ability to go beyond isn't quite as great.
Yeah.
But the horizon for me means this place, because for me, George has helped me see that when we look out to the lake from this location, the horizon is higher
Yes.
than it is other places.
Yes.
And I grew up on the Atlantic in South Carolina, where it's very low,
Oh.
where it's practically a flat plain from the
okay.
beach.
Oh.
Partly because the land itself is so little above sea level, whereas here we're quite a few feet.
We immediately rise.
Yes,
Yes.
and
The
it's-
beautiful rocks out here outside George's
Exactly.
windows. Yeah. You know, George, one of the things we've talked before, of course, about your work, and one of the things that happened to me right away, which I think has happened to Margot, is that I began to see things that I didn't see before. Rocks that you have painted suddenly took on different dimensions for me. And I think that's one of the marvelous things that a visual artist does for us. We need you, George. It's wonderful. Is there anything that you notice that's changing now that you live on the reservation? Anything changing for you in your concept of yourself as an artist who is an Indian? Do you feel that you're doing things differently or living differently?
Well, as I mentioned before, I'm coming back to the source, and it seems to fit into my scheme of life in a very good way. So that's the way I'm living now, by the water, and all the environment being my source of inspiration
Yes.
for my work.
The name of this spot here on Lake Superior you call Red Rock, and I noticed you said jasper is your stone. What does that mean, George? I don't understand.
Well, it was just a connection of, by coincidence, jasper is a common rock around here, and this area is known as the Red Rock area, so there's always that nice connection.
It's a very special place,
Yes.
isn't it? It
Yes.
has been ever since Native Americans lived along the shore here, which they did, of course, long before us non-Indians did. Yes. Well, I noticed too that you talked a little bit to Margot about your magic, and that you have some jars that have materials in them, tobacco and herbs and natural things. This is a reaching back too, isn't it, to spiritual roots? A little
Well,
bit.
there might be a possible connection. I would certainly like to think that would be the case. I like the idea of
Smells good, George.
yes. There's
smells
lots
wonderful.
of nice herbs in there that are part of the what I call the magic.
Yes.
And I feel that here again, just by having it, is the magic for me to help to give me health and power and in a good spiritual Indian way.
You know, George, I think we feel that with you. Even though you've had problems, physical problems that have afflicted you, you always have that strong spirit coming forth. Every time I see you in the post office and ask you how you're feeling, you always say, oh, I'm going to be all right.
Okay.
That's marvelous. And of course, your small horizon paintings are a product of having been somewhat limited physically.
Yes.
And we certainly think of that as a wonderful, wonderful heritage for all of us. We're appreciative of it. Well, this has been a marvelous opportunity. I'm so happy to have had a chance to visit with both of you here. That's a pleasure. Margot Fortunato Galt has been the industrious person who has spent years interviewing George Morrison by tape recorder and then compiling a beautiful book, Turning the Feather Around, this wonderful book. And George Morrison, the well-known and much respected Minnesota painter who has a worldwide reputation and whose work hangs in museums and art galleries all over the world. We're immensely proud of you, George. Even Governor Carlson has said you're a treasure, and we all applauded when we heard that proclamation, because we think so too. And the Grand Portage Band has honored you also, haven't they?
Thank you. I'm very proud of that honor too.
I know you are, yes, and we're very proud of you too.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. This has been your program of Northern Lights. Please tune in again. Sighting Atlantis. Abram and Tom on Lake Superior. Abram on the lake knows cold, depths, shoals, trick winds, charts, whatever underwrites small boats. He walks the dock dizzy with days waterborne. Sea legs from chanties buckle his stride, and surfaces take getting used to. How he feels afloat makes life ashore unreal. How he walks on land recalls planks instead of earth, a balance danced over rippling liquid, the sinews of a monster lake. This is life on the water. Hot sun, cold air, breeze in a sail caught like a wild thing, made to move a boy, his dad, their chip of boat. 5 Mile Rock shows an offshore naval on their charts. The world's beginning. Out from this island vortex, this rock of nesting gulls, ride the rings of navigation. Afloat where land looks wild and new from wide water, sailors know the heart and reach of what they seek, and islands moving on the compass rise Atlantean to a boy's half-forgotten quests ashore.